is a trooper. It is 2 a.m. in Tokyo, and joining us on the phone, Marc Faber. Marc, good evening to you.
It's a pleasure for me to be with you.
Marc, there's so much going on commodities, but I want to bring up your research note right away. There's a great shot of Marc Faber and the Gloom, Boom, and Doom report. Let's bring up, there it is. It may be wise to question some things. Marc Faber, I would argue that a global systemic collapse would, in relative terms, benefit the United States. Marc Faber, why does the United States benefit if we get the gloomy view you subscribe to?
Well, I think in a really negative environment where everything collapses, the U.S. is still a relatively self-sustained economy. They produce enough food, and they have the resources even to produce enough energy if they wanted to. The problem is that interest lobbies prevent new sources of energy to be developed, and so the U.S. is still highly dependent on imported oil. But aside from imported oil, and I would say in life, you need to eat every day, but you don't need to go to your office every day. You could do your job from your home.
Right.
And so essentially energy consumption could go down substantially in a crisis level. If I were really very negative about the whole world, I would say I'd better be in the U.S. than, say, in Guatemala, Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, wherever I am.
Okay, I know that, Marc. Let's bring up the CRB index here. It's a Reuters-Jefferies CRB index, and there it is, folks. And look at that chart as we're getting up there near those 2008 peaks. Marc, you have been calling for this. Can we have a commodity boom with prosperity, or do we just assume it's a negative outcome?
The problem is this. Mr. Bernanke decided to print money, and the Federal Reserve has done that for the last 30 years, since 1980. And when you print money, what the central banks can't decide is where the money will flow to. So it flowed into NASDAQ 97 to 2000, March 2000. And then it flowed into real estate and collapsed. And in 2008, it flowed into commodities. And now again, it flows into rising oil, energy prices, and food prices. And the problem is this, that as these prices go up, it hurts the majority of the population, namely the poor and the middle class.
Right.
The well-to-do, if you're at Goldman Sachs or Citigroup or JP Morgan, your percentage that you spend on energy and food is very low, so you don't care.
Right.
But for the majority of people, it's a big thing.
Marc, let me bring up this ratio here, and it's from your report. I want to bring this up, folks. This is a great ratio. It's the S&P 500 versus the Morgan Stanley Emerging Markets Index, and you can see with the line going down the last number of years, that emerging markets have outperformed. You can see in the late 90s, the S&P did well. Marc Faber, you're suggesting buy America because in disaster, the United States wins?
Well, I'm suggesting that America will outperform. It doesn't mean that it will go up. And I think we have begun a kind of a correction period where all markets will go lower for the next 3 months. And I think there is a possibility, it hasn't happened yet, that the US dollar will rally and that bonds somewhat will rally. But in general, if you're very bearish about emerging economies, you shouldn't be bullish about the U.S. I'm just saying the U.S. would go down less than emerging economies. And I happen to think that the correction began in emerging economies in November,
right,
and will go lower, and that the U.S. now is peaking out and will go lower.
Marc, I want to bring up a chart here which pushes against your gloom. When you come on, Marc, you know I get all sorts of emails that you're so gloomy and all that. How do you explain then, Mark, if you have fears, and with your huge following, clearly there are fears that many people agree with, how do you explain the growth in the American economy since 1947? I mean, the idea is, what a world, we're all going to die, taking it from the Wizard of Oz, but the fact is we keep growing, we keep growing, we keep growing, and yet you're gloomy. How do you push against the optimism of half a century?
Let's put it this way. Maybe statistically the U.S. is growing, but relative to the rest of the world, and I was born in 1946, I'm 65 years old. In the 1950s, America was above everything else. We talked about in America, they invented this, washing machines and appliances and whatever it was. And today, relative to the rest of the world, America is nothing. And for the first time in the history of capitalism, the emerging world is more powerful than the Western world. That is a huge change,
Mark,
and it will bring a huge tensions in the world.
Mark, I know you're coming to us from Japan, and I know you live in Thailand. Why does everybody want to come to America if you would suggest we're in relative decline?
I don't think everybody wants to come to America. I think a lot of Americans want to go overseas. And if Americans could freely opt to be citizens of other countries, which they cannot, they would opt for that. And if Americans could have accounts overseas, which is very difficult nowadays for Americans to have, they would opt for that.
Okay, Mark, we're going to have to leave it there. Marc Faber, thank you so much. Greatly appreciate Mr. Faber coming to us from Tokyo in the very early morning. We've got